Hi everyone, I hope you're well. First of all, my hair is pink. Yes, I'm not sure how long I'm gonna keep it pink, but I actually do really like it at the moment, so I think I'm gonna keep it at least maybe a month or so. The shade might change, but you know, whatever. This might be a very long video, so I think I should just get right into it. So I studied sociology in college, and one of my research projects was about metalheads, and in fact I had it going on in a few different classes at once, because we were allowed to do that, and in fact we were sometimes encouraged to develop the same theme or topic in different areas. But I did that because I was actually really curious about this idea of realness or authenticity and fakeness or poserness. I know that I've made at least a few different videos on this channel on that subject, that very specific subject, and I think something very important to individuals oftentimes is belonging in groups. So in order to belong in a group, or in order to know that whether you belong in a group or not, you have to know what it would take for you to belong in it. So in other words, you would have to know what it means to be XYZ in order to know whether you can be considered one or not. But of course, what makes this all very complex is the fact that there's no set and formal official definition for pretty much any kind of subcultures. It's not like there's a specific list of behavior, dressing, or things like that allow you to have full certainty that you belong or don't belong somewhere. So what I wanted to get to in this study was basically to find a common ground or a sort of common way of thinking among the metalheads of my city, a way in which they tend to define what makes and doesn't make a metalhead. So I did both an interview and a survey. I interviewed 6 people, 3 women and 3 men, between the ages of 18 and 30, and I also surveyed 60 people. I don't want to bore you too much with the theory or anything like that, but I was trying to find signs of admitted, let me call it the way that we would call it, in Spanish at least, it's fachada, which as a concept basically refers to the way that you make yourself appear and the things that you surround yourself with. For example, if you have posters on the walls of your bedroom of bands that you like and you wear band t-shirts or whatever, then that is a sort of fachada that you are putting to the outside world as something that is meant to identify you. So it's an image that you are deliberately putting out to others, although you're not necessarily controlling, of course, the interpretation that other people have. So I ask things like whether they dress like metalheads, and whether they consider that that's something that's necessary to consider yourself a metalhead, and whether they surround themselves as well with things that are related to metal listening, like CDs, of course, band t-shirts, posters, things of the sort. And I also ask them, of course, if they consider that that's something essential or important in some way to consider themselves and consider other people metalheads. So as for the interview specifically, the questions, which were usually first ones of what is metal and what is a metalhead, are probably the ones that tended to depend the most on the specific type of subgenre that they listen to. But pretty much everyone did answer that in order to be a metalhead, there's not just a liking to the music genre, right? But there's also some sort of attitude associated with it. Usually one that is separate to others and thinks for themselves, and other values that could be associated with individuality especially. So one of the people that I interviewed, he mostly listened to thrash and black metal. And interestingly, he also associated metal and being a metalhead with an experience of poverty, which I find interesting because I think if you could associate those concepts with any subgenre of metal, it would probably be thrash metal. And another interviewee said, who mostly listens to doom metal and traditional heavy metal, would define the attitude of a metalhead with something that is more like individualistic and a bit more autonomous, right? Having your own ideas, living despite what others think of you and stuff like that. And I'm not saying that you necessarily will base your ideas on the type of metal that you listen to, but I think that there is some degree of relation, right, between the stuff that appeals to you the most and the ideas that you already had, or the things that you already felt and had experienced in your life, of course. Now, people in the interviews don't really speak of authenticity as a concept by name, but they do insinuate it a few times by talking about people who say they are or pretend to be metalheads, who are obviously, by implication, are obviously fake. One of the interviewees said that someone who is not an authentic metalhead only listens to metal for the sound and doesn't understand it. But interestingly, another one actually said the opposite, that he doesn't give much thought to the images and the lyrics and what the music is about, and that he doesn't necessarily feel identified with the songs, see himself in the songs or whatever, but he rather listens to them mainly because of the sound. What I think pretty much all of these people agreed on separately, because of course I did the interviews to all these people separately, is that someone who is fake will be someone who doesn't really know anything about the bands that are the more essential ones, or that came before the ones that they listen to. Presumably those who only listen to and only know and only care about the new bands, but they don't know what came before them, and they basically don't know anything about how the genre came to be. So something that I was also interested in was knowing the ideal type of metalhead that the interviewees had. What I mean by ideal type is not exactly a stereotype, but it's something a little bit close to that. Basically, what I mean is what exactly comes in your mind in terms of an image when someone says the word metalhead. And they refer to these very specific image and clothing types, like long hair, of course, dressing mostly in black. Those are the main ones that are mentioned. I think it's also interesting that a lot of them try to basically separate themselves from the ideal type, or something from the stereotype of a metalhead, even the ones that did dress in a more expectedly metalhead way. For example, one of them said, well, I do have long hair and I wear black clothes, but I don't wear chains or spikes or anything like that. And I think it's interesting, and the way I interpret this is they want to also add some individuality to their belonging in this group. You want to belong to the group, but you also don't want to seem like you are like all the other metalheads as well. And I think that's also because metalheads don't want to be perceived as homogeneous, because of course, since there's such a strong focus on individuality, then they would rather be perceived as individuals, even though they are also decidedly part of a group and would also like to be perceived as being a part of the group. And also this distancing themselves from other metalheads goes beyond appearance, because in some moments they talk about how they are a little bit different from other metalheads in terms of attitude or personality. Some said that they don't really care that much for the lyrics or the images that are violent, that they don't think of themselves as especially rebellious or anti-system, and that they generally have different ideas that they associate with other metalheads, which is of course their ideal type of metalhead, their sort of general idea of what a metalhead is. Now I want to talk about the survey. So like I said, I had 60 different cases or individuals who were surveyed, and I'm going to go about the results now and the patterns that I found. So the average age of the people who responded is 29. The youngest person was 19 and the oldest was 49. Now the survey was done to anyone who declared that they mostly listened to metal. However, not everyone considered themselves to be metalheads, and I thought that was very important for the point of the study, what exactly caused them to consider themselves or not to be metalheads. One of the questions was how long they had been listening to metal for. And of course, I also asked them whether they considered themselves metalheads or not. And what's interesting is that the correlation between the answers of these two gives me this result. So most people who said that they did consider themselves to be metalhead had been listening to it for at least 10 years. Most people who did not consider themselves to be metalhead had been listening to metal for less than 10 years. I'm not sure what interpretation to give to this. I guess I could state the obvious and say that maybe they don't think they are authentic enough or know enough bands to consider themselves metalheads. I will go on this a little bit later, but I think there is some degree of reluctance to talk about yourself in certain ways when you don't want to be seen as pretentious, or you don't want people to contradict you and to say that you are not who you say you are. I specifically think that because in the ages where you are a little bit younger, or in this era where you are just starting to become part of a community, it's sort of this vulnerable state in which a person has to see whether they will be accepted in a community or not. And I think people sometimes might be reluctant to call themselves metalheads. Could obviously be genuinely because they don't really consider themselves to be that, or because maybe metal isn't really a big part of their interests overall. But I do think it's at least partly because of this, because of the fact that people might be a little bit more afraid of being considered fake when they don't know for sure that they are part of a community, when they haven't been as established in it as for long enough to be completely confident inside this community. So something else that I asked is what subgenre they mostly listen to. And something that I found, again, by finding the patterns between two different answers, is that a bit less than half of those people who did not consider themselves to be metalheads mainly listen to traditional or classic heavy metal. However, those who mostly listen to heavy, classic heavy, also made about a third of the ones that did consider themselves metalheads. Also, something that is interesting is that none of the two survey takers who mainly listen to glam, nor the two who mainly listen to gothic metal, consider themselves to be metalheads. Another question was whether you consider it important to go to concerts and shows to consider yourself a metalhead, and the vast majority said no. As you can imagine, all of those who considered it important to go to concerts and shows to consider yourself a metalhead also did go to concerts frequently themselves. As they said, at least 3 times a year. Most of those people who said that it wasn't important only went from 0 to 5 times a year. However, it is also a pretty large portion of people who said that it wasn't an important aspect, but they did go frequently. I also asked them how many albums they had bought, CDs or whatever, vinyls, whatever the case may be, how many albums they had bought in the last 12 months. And also I will compare that to whether they consider themselves metalheads. So the ones who had bought 5 or less albums in the last 12 months mostly did consider themselves metalheads, but also the vast majority of the ones who did not consider themselves metalheads had bought 5 or less in the last 12 months. I also asked them how many items of merch they had bought in the last 12 months, so including t-shirts and patches and things like that. There's a slight difference, by which I mean that people apparently bought more merch than they bought CDs or albums or whatever. And I guess you could argue that obviously there is a change in consumption of music because obviously there's streaming services and all these things. However, I do consider metalheads to be very traditionalist in the sense that they will occasionally buy CDs, even if they are not planning to directly listen to the CD, but rather they also stream music. So I guess you could argue that the main reason why someone would buy more merch than the actual music itself is because, people have Spotify nowadays or whatever. But I think it's also because, to some degree, clothes and patches and stuff like that are things that you can carry with yourself. and have as like a part of your identity, right? In order to show your interests to people who are just kind of members of the public or whatever. Another thing that I ask them is what are the main values that they associate with metal. I didn't specify whether I meant as a community or as a music genre. I just decided that I would let them kind of interpret that themselves. The most popular answers were freedom, individuality, and authenticity. The other options that I chose based on the interviews, because I did them before, were unity and equality or justice. The least popular answer was unity. So something that I would like to add is that there wasn't that much of a difference in the values cited by between the people who said that they did consider themselves metalheads and the ones who didn't. Aside from that, it was slightly more common for people who did consider themselves to be metalheads with a frequency of 15 to say that one of the main values was authenticity or originality, whilst among the people who said that they didn't consider themselves to be metalheads, it was 11, which is slightly significant considering that a bit over half of the people who took the survey, even if they did mainly listen to metal, didn't consider themselves to be metalheads. So the last question was, aside from musical taste, what makes a metalhead? I had made a few options myself that again I had taken from the ideas from the interviews, but I also allowed them to add their own as an other option. And the largest percentage was 45%, were people who said that there was no other characteristic, that it was just musical taste. Then 25% saying that it was the attitude or their worldview and thinking by themselves. 13% said it was their knowledge about the genre and its origins and the classics, so the essentials of the genre. Then 8.3% said that it was about being part of the community, the local community of metalheads. Then 5% said that it was about having had experiences similar to the topics presented in the lyrics or images of metal. Then 1.7%, which is really just one person, said being part of a metal band. And then another person said alcohol, drugs, and horse. I'm not sure if that was a joke or not. Now let me talk about something rather interesting about these results. So I also compared the results of the people who consider themselves or not to be metalheads and what they said the main characteristic was for a metalhead, right? Because it's interesting that the majority of the responses from people who did not consider themselves to be metalheads, but again did mainly listen to metal, also said that the only characteristic needed to consider yourself a metalhead or someone else was music taste. So it's a little bit contradictory in a way, right? If you consider that the only thing that it takes to be a metalhead is the music taste, and you have the music taste, then why wouldn't you consider yourself a metalhead? And that's why I have that sort of hypothesis behind it, right? That maybe they are a little bit reluctant to declare themselves as a metalhead, or at least in front of other metalheads. And I also found one answer interesting in that last question where I asked what characteristic was needed. Because someone said, as you saw, someone said that you needed to be in a band. And they also explained later on was that the community was sort of divided, or the way that he saw it, the community was pretty much separated into the consumers and the artists, and he basically saw the artists as the only true metalheads in a way, which is very interesting because I definitely had never seen anyone really make a separation between consumers and artists when it comes to metalheads. At least not a metalhead themselves, because usually I feel like metalheads will think of them as essentially the same community, just in different positions at different times. So like I said, I think it's kind of interesting how a lot of the survey takers and the interviewees themselves basically did admit to have a lot of these, if not pretty much all the characteristics that they considered to be necessary to be metalheads, but they also didn't really consider themselves to be metalheads, or they were sometimes a little bit wishy-washy about it. I think this really strengthens my idea that identity is sometimes something frail, at least when it comes to certain times in your life, or especially when you are younger, more preteen. In my previous video, where I wasn't talking about this very scientifically or anything, but I was talking about how when I was more of a preteen, I was very preoccupied with whether other metalheads would accept me as one of them, which of course has become much less important in the last years. But I don't think that's just because, I have matured and I have found more important things. Because at the time, that was extremely important to me, because this is an age where you don't really know who you are and your identity could really change very easily. And like I said, it's a very vulnerable state in which you could easily be either accepted in a group or rejected from it. So even though this was a very small little project that I did for school, I found it very interesting, the kind of things that people said. Some of the answers were a little unexpected, and I don't know, I would like to know your take on this, or your hypothesis on some of these answers that were a little bit more unexpected, and whether you yourself agree with some of the answers on what makes a metalhead or not. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video and you found it interesting, and I will see you in the next one.